Two and a Half Admins, episode 191. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. Here's our first look at Apple's in-the-box iPhone updating machine.
So the concept here, it's a very specifically consumer-friendly concept. People don't like going to the Apple Store and buying their expensive new iPhone and then having to spend, an hour or two downloading updates and setting things up and configuring and, yada, yada, yada. And you can't necessarily elide all of the setting up and configuring part, but the fetching the updates part, that you can get done before handing the customer their new phone in unopened factory sealed box. And the way this essentially works is it's via NFC. It's the same near field communication technology that, like, if you've ever seen those little plaques on the wall that you can tap your phone to and automatically join somebody's guest Wi-Fi network, same technology. The difference is, on the client side in the phone has to be willing to be woken up by the near field communication. It has to be willing to join the Wi-Fi network without user prompting, which normally you have to tap something to accept on the phone screen, after you tap the phone itself to the tag to get connected. That part's going to need to go away because the phone is still in a box, factory sealed. So once you've done all of that, then the NFC can command the phone to, do a system update. And as a result, you can have all your phones in the store that are brand new in factory sealed packaging, and yet they're all the way freshly up to date when you hand them to the customer. Sounds great, right?
Yeah, I had some questions. First, how do they keep from running out of battery? Or are they also wirelessly charging them through the box?
Yeah, Qi.
Okay.
Qi charging.
I suppose.
So I have an unpopular take on this one, as I have discovered in the depths of the Ars Technica comment threads. I don't like this. I completely get how consumer-friendly it is, and I get how attractive it is to somebody who wants to go buy an iPhone that, you don't have to do that step anymore. That sounds amazing. The problem with it is the whole concept. You'll notice how I kept saying brand new in factory sealed packaging. It isn't. What they're really doing is they're selling you a phone that is not in a factory sealed package. It's been mess-withable for however long the store has had it, because they can put it in the toaster and they can command it to do things. Now, I'm not telling you that this just means that, an Apple Store employee can put the phone in the toaster and just immediately do whatever they want to with it because that's how it works. That's not how it works. But it's a pretty large attack surface that you're opening up on things that are in what normal humans will consider factory sealed packaging has not been tampered with. And it's not. In my opinion, if this was a thing that you really wanted to do, well, what makes sense is you forego the whole, the unboxing experience. You say if you want your phone completely up to date, that's completely fine. We got you, fam. Here's a phone that we have in our open area that, is updated and it's brand new, but it's not in a package, but here you go and it's ready to use. And some people will be like, yeah, I want to do that. That's convenient. And some people will be like me and be kind of paranoid and be like, nah, I want something in a factory sealed package. And some other people, very much not like any of the three of us recording this show, will be like, no, I want my unboxing experience. Don't you dare mess that up for me.
Yeah, but I could definitely see, especially with things like your phone or YubiKey and a bunch of other stuff, it's I definitely want one that I can tell no one has touched before. And the fact that they can now touch it through the sealed box raises all kinds of questions, right? Remember back in the early days of the Snowden leaks and so on, finding out that, the government would intercept these shipments from Cisco and put stuff in the firmware of the router before they delivered it to the people who bought it so that they would have access to their network. And it's you don't want that happening with your iPhone. Now, the iPhone has a bunch of protection with, trying to only run signed software and so on. And so it's likely not, in most cases, that you're not going to randomly see a lot of people getting phones that have been tampered with, but it does seem like this is opening up that surface area. If you keep your phone for how many years, at least 1 or 2, and you're more worried about that 1 hour when you first bought it, it's maybe people need to be a little bit less about instant gratification when they buy their new phone.
Which is very true, but unfortunately, people are human and they behave like humans, which means you'll have outliers, like those of us who are recording this, and likely quite a few of the folks who are listening who are no, I don't want to make that sacrifice. That's a bad choice. But most people will be like, well, you just told me that I can have a bunch of things I don't care much about, or I can have one thing that I do care about. They're going to pick the thing they care about.
Yeah.
There's also bandwidth concerns. We're coming at this very much from a Western perspective, but people who only have mobile internet and, they're downloading hundreds of megabytes worth of updates, that's not free to them necessarily.
Yeah, and especially if you're getting an older iPhone, like getting an iPhone when it didn't just come out, it might mean you have gigabytes of downloads and, that might be your whole month's data cap or something.
Although I was assured repeatedly in those aforementioned Ars Technica comment threads that no iPhone stays in an Apple store for more than like 10 to 14 days tops. You can look at the records and see. And I don't know, that's possible. But then that leads me to like, well, if the damn things are only staying in the store for a week, maybe two, then this isn't really a problem, is it? Because you won't have that many updates to apply, will ya?
Well, they spend that long in the store, but how long did they spend on a boat coming over from China?
Exactly.
It does seem kind of like there's probably enough of us that where's the option from Apple to pay $100 extra for a box that had a Faraday cage built into it? It was like, here's one we tell you it's sealed and no one's fucked with it.
So hang on, Alan. You're telling me that not only do you expect a large corporate vendor to give you options in 2024 on a consumer-targeted product, but you specifically expect Apple to give you configurable options that you can choose from and make it your own rather than be exactly the perfect thing that Apple designed it to be. Is that what you're saying?
It's still the perfect thing Apple designed it to be. I'm just saying they're going to give me a different box than some of the other people.
Yeah, and to be fair to Alan, he did say he'd pay a ridiculous amount of money for this upgrade, which is very much Apple's MO.
I didn't say ridiculous, but yes.
You said $100, dude. That's a lot of money.
Yeah.
Amazon ditches just walk out checkouts at its grocery stores. This is hilarious, not because they're ditching it, but because the whole idea of this was that you go into the shop, you pick out your milk and your bread and whatever, and then you just walk out and the bunch of cameras follow you around and the AI works out what you've picked up and how much to charge you. Well, it turns out that there was some AI involved, but there were also about 1,000 people in India watching the videos and just manually deciding what you'd bought.
Well, I tell you, Joe, I would never have expected a shenanigan like that out of the company that brought us the Mechanical Turk. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Mechanical Turk, because it's nowhere near as popular as it was a decade or two ago, the concept of the Mechanical Turk is folks in countries where it's very, very cheap to live and you generally don't expect to get paid much to work. You can jump on the Mechanical Turk and signal your availability to complete simple tasks. And as you complete those tasks, and they may only take a few minutes at a time, or they may take an hour or whatever, you get offered a small amount of money for each task you complete. And in the early 2000s, when I last seriously looked at this, I actually, at the time, I was considering doing a little bit of it myself, because if you picked the jobs carefully, you could actually end up making anywhere from 15 to 20 bucks an hour if you were lucky and you knew exactly what you're doing and got on top of it and worked your ass off. And at that time in my career, I could have used a few extra hours of, making 15 or 20 bucks an hour. So yeah, this is really just the Mechanical Turk all over again. And also adding to the hilarity, if you don't know why Amazon called it the Mechanical Turk, it's a reference to an old scam where somebody claimed they had built a robot, but there was a little dude inside, making the arms move and talking.
I think it was playing chess originally. They were like, yes, I made this robot and it can beat you at chess, but it was actually just a guy inside a robot suit, basically.
There was definitely a fake chess automaton with a guy inside. I can't remember for certain whether that was the Mechanical Turk or whether the Mechanical Turk was a different, automaton grift.
Yeah. Because even when it first came out, I think one of the main use cases for the Mechanical Turk for Amazon even was typing out the list of songs from the back of the jewel case of CDs. So they had pictures of all the CDs they were selling, because back then Amazon sold books and music and that was it. And they just would have the CD and it would have the list of songs on the back, but they didn't have that as text and OCR didn't work that well yet. And so they're like, well, if we can find people that will accept 25 cents to type out the names of 16 songs, then we can do that. But anyway, for the just walk out stuff, yeah, they tried the AI, but it was only being accurate 20 or 30% of the time. And that's a lot of groceries for people to be walk out and not getting charged for. Or worse, if we charge somebody for the wrong thing, they're going to complain and say, I didn't buy a whatever that it said I did. And so they just had a bunch of people manually looking at this video footage and deciding what was in their baskets.
I remember the tech news coverage of that Just Walk Out stuff when it first deployed. Ars Technica sent somebody, I don't remember who, they sent somebody into one of those stores to like try it out. And they kind of red teamed it a little bit. You know, they did a bunch of stuff that looked like they were stealing things to see if like they'd get flagged for it or whatever, because they were really looking more for issues with potential false positives, because the first thought was like, oh, this thing is immediately going to accuse people of being shoplifters and going to be this big ugly thing. And they couldn't trick it. Like they kept trying and trying and trying. And like, no, it worked every time. They're like, I can't believe this works this well. And well, turns out 1,000 people in India are a little smarter than AI.
AI bots hallucinate software packages and devs download them. This is a novel attack vector.
Yeah, if we think back to things like LeftPad and so on, and even just the XZip thing from last week, it turns out that if all of your software stack hinges on this one little toothpick, that once compromised can cause a problem, what happens if everybody just asks AI to write the code for them, and the AI always inserts this one package that it made up?
Yeah, and then somebody creates the package that the AI has made up and puts it in the repository, and then a bunch of people download it. And this is exactly what has happened. Researchers did it, thankfully, with just empty packages that weren't nefarious, but there's nothing stopping someone putting actual malware in the place of these empty packages.
None of this should really come as a surprise. I mean, it's appropriate in a couple of ways to bring up LeftPad in context with this, because not only was LeftPad an example of an existing NPM package being compromised because the developer got pissed off and, then screwing up a ton of packages that had as a dependency, more importantly for this particular example, LeftPad was so incredibly trivial that nobody ever should have included it in anything to begin with. LeftPad literally just a single line would do the same thing that LeftPad does. There's no reason to wrap adding spaces to the left of a string. You don't need to make a function for that, let alone do you need to import a function that somebody else wrote from a third-party repository to do the same thing that a line in the language itself would do. So when you have developers who will cheerfully add dependencies like LeftPad to projects, there's literally no reason that anyone should think that the same developers wouldn't try to include fake packages that some AI had hallucinated.
Yeah, I think we haven't yet got back to the time when people worried about minimizing dependencies and be like, I don't want to suck in every package in the repo as part of my software. And trying to prune that to limit the surface area and so on. And I think a lot of software developers don't really consider the maintenance burden that really does come from using that many dependencies and knowing that you're going to have to keep up with their new releases and their API changes and their support cycles. And the fact that people are so readily happy to just include more and more dependencies mean that these fake ones have a real chance to just get added in there and no one knows why, but no one wants to risk taking one out because maybe it'll break something.
Well, if we're talking about a more substantial dependency than something, silly like LeftPad, if we're talking about a dependency that's like several thousand lines of code, well, that's several thousand lines of code that you don't personally have to maintain. And, that can be a huge deal and that can make sense to add that as a dependency. Yes, you do need to, have some kind of sense of whether somebody's maintaining that code because you're not, but that can very easily be worth it. However, again, when we're talking about something that, it's literally like a 3-line function, no, don't do that. You don't get anything good out of that. The only thing you're getting out of that is the potential for compromise and vulnerability and exploits.
What I find interesting about this is that the software packages that these various LLMs are making up are not just like randomly once and then that's it. There's a pattern here. They keep over and over hallucinating the same thing. And that's what makes this exploitable.
It's essentially a Berenstain-Bears problem. Haven't you ever been convinced of something and gone around talking about it for weeks or potentially years and then found out not only is that not true, you have no idea where you even got that idea, but at some point you decided that was a thing, and until something forced you to re-examine it, it had already passed your filter. So it was just a part of your mental state. It seemed normal to you. It's the same mechanism with the AIs. Yeah, there's going to be patterns because the thing that the quote creativity unquote slider allowed to make it weirdly into the output that you took in Well, it's not just completely random nonsense or it'd look like line noise. Like there is a pattern there. It is getting that from some association somewhere in the model, and that association is going to crop up repeatedly.
Yeah, and they can often seem very convincing. We saw late last year, was it? The lawyer got in trouble for citing cases that didn't actually exist because they asked ChatGPT for help writing their legal brief.
It's almost, and I know this is very controversial, I'm sorry, but it's almost like you shouldn't offload your own human level work onto something with roughly the synapse count of a flatworm and think it'll do a good job.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by Tailscale. Go to tailscale.com/25A. Tailscale is an easy-to-deploy, zero-config, no-fuss VPN that allows you to build simple networks across complex infrastructure. It's super simple to set up, and you can have machines and devices all over the world connected to each other as if they were on the same LAN in minutes. It's WireGuard on easy mode. Jim tried Tailscale and found it incredibly easy to pick up and use for the first time. He liked that most of the time it immediately negotiates a direct point-to-point connection that's almost as fast as encrypted point-to-point, and it's got fallback modes to keep you functioning even if something changes the network topology and breaks the point-to-point introduction. So support the show and check out Tailscale for yourself. Go to tailscale.com/25A and try Tailscale out for free for up to 100 devices and 3 users with no credit card required. That's tailscale.com/25A. Caribbean nation of Aruba backs itself up to the Internet Archive.
I love this one. Aruba is, as mentioned, a small Caribbean nation. It is very near to one of the places that I grew up. I finished my last couple of years of high school in the U.S. Virgin Islands. So it kind of felt like somewhere in the vicinity of something that feels like a childhood home doing real good. And since I spent most of my childhood in Alabama, that really made an impression. Essentially, it's just, Aruba's outsourcing their data backup for, government data to the Internet Archive, which I think is fantastic on a number of levels. One, the Internet Archive has been doing an amazing job of very large-scale archival work for a long time now. It does it very efficiently with very little budget. It does effectively. It's great. And the fact that a nation is willing to outsource its archival data to a third party like that that's outside its borders, I also love that because it says a lot about the amount of things that Aruba's not trying to hide. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying I think that Aruba doesn't have state secrets that aren't going out to the Internet Archive. I'm sure, like absolutely 100% sure, it does. But just the fact that that much of its stuff it's willing to just dump onto a third party, again, speaks a lot. Can you imagine the United States government, the Canadian government, the British government doing that?
Yeah, well, I would actually love to see more things like those governments not necessarily offload this, but at least contribute the contents of their national library and national archives to things like this, because we've seen that they are not always great about making that very accessible to other people. And the Internet Archive seems to do a much better job of even just cataloging the stuff and making it findable and searchable than what you often get from national libraries and archives in individual countries.
Thought experiment. What if instead of having to file a FOIA, you could just hit the Internet Archive?
Yeah.
Now, there are problems with that. I'm not saying like that's a panacea and we should do that immediately and not think twice about it. Don't get me wrong. But it's a very interesting thought experiment to think about, like, how would that change the level of discourse in society when this supposedly public data that in practice, very few people can get access to, and it's very cumbersome and difficult and takes a long time and, can be somewhat expensive. What if that was just a click away and it was truly public information and not just information that the public can, in theory, find out if somebody who knows what they're doing well enough spends enough time to get at it eventually, which is what we've got right now. For my non-American listeners, FOIA is an acronym for the Freedom of Information Act, which is a United States law that gets used to request information from our government when our government really doesn't want to give you that information, but it has to if you know how to ask.
We've got that too.
Yeah, we have a similar thing here in Canada. But yeah, and often the FOIA involves them actually deciding how much of it really still needs to be classified and so on, and blacking out a bunch of stuff.
No problem, Alan. An LLM can do that for us.
But imagine if just the contents of the Library of the Congress were more accessible than they are now. just, every book that's ever been published, that kind of stuff.
Honestly, our hypothetical censor GPT might do every bit as good a job as the real censors do when they elide stuff out of those kind of requests, because they so frequently not only black out things that they shouldn't, but just miss things that absolutely should not have been exposed. So it's essentially like we're already using AI for that.
Yeah. And the other interesting thing is how this started. It was actually Stacey Argondizzo, who happened to be vacationing there with her family, like she has done since being a child, kind of similar to Jim's story. And she happened to work at the Internet Archive back in 2018 when she started the ball rolling on getting this done. So as you can see, being a government, it took a while to actually happen. But knowing that all these documents, which I think was 40,000 documents, 60,000 images, and a bunch of 3D object scans and so on, will now at least be preserved.
6 years is overnight for that kind of policy change, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Also, just to move that much data. Because, I'm guessing that stuff had to be scanned and stuff. It wasn't already digitized either.
What's not clear to me is who paid for this. Was it just on the Internet Archive's dime or what?
I think the actual scanning and stuff, it sounds like maybe was done by Aruba, and then it's just the storage that's on the archive.
But that's not free.
No, it's not. And to the best of my knowledge, the monetary details of that relationship have not been divulged by either party. It's a deal of we can speculate. It certainly seems like an easy way to imagine the Internet Archive getting access to some desperately needed funding, because it could charge a fairly standard rate to Aruba that Aruba would agree to pay, and it would all be fairly automatic and just work nicely, as opposed to, the current funding model, which is largely, hope a few million people give us $5 every now and then.
It says here specifically, despite having limited funds, Aruba had its own scanning equipment that it could use for the project, but the Internet Archive provided their specialized software for organizing the collection and including algorithms to decipher the handwriting and turn centuries-old penmanship into digital text that's actually readable.
I mean, I certainly hope that the citizens of Aruba ultimately are the ones, footing the bill for this, because that's what makes sense. The government represents the citizens and the government gets its money from the citizens, and all that stuff just makes sense. It's possible that the Internet Archive kind of went out on a limb and is... I refuse to believe there's no money involved in a project of this scale, but it's possible that they did, a loss leader kind of a deal and took some money, but not enough to make it self-sustaining, which, if that's the case, that wouldn't be entirely out of character for the Internet Archive by any means. I would still love them for that. I would think that was great, but I'd be happier if a mutually sensible agreement was worked out that can just continue to function for decades.
Yep. And it turns out it's not the first time. The Internet Archive back in 2011 partnered with the Cultural Office of Bali to back up about 90% of Bali's literature into the Internet Archive.
Essentially, in my opinion, the Internet Archive ought to already be receiving quite a bit of taxpayer funding from quite a few countries, just for the benefit that normal people get out of it. It is enough of an important resource that it should be properly community funded, and not just a grab bag of whoever has morals enough and energy enough and awareness enough to remember to hand them a couple of bucks every now and then. It should be properly funded. And it shouldn't be any one country's project. It shouldn't just be funded with US taxpayer dollars or British taxpayer dollars or Aruba taxpayer dollars. There ought to be something similar to a United Nations kind of a setup for, global infrastructure that everybody can actually benefit from. And this is one of those things.
Maybe they could take over ICANN while they're at it.
Well, they can't screw it up any worse, can they?
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. If you want to join those people, you can go to 2.5admins.com/support. And remember that for various amounts on Patreon, you can get an advert-free RSS feed that includes either just this show or all the shows in the Late Night Linux family. And if you want to send any questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Another perk of being a patron is you get to skip the queue, which is what Furacle has done. They write, can you talk about disk queue schedulers in Linux? How weird does your workload have to be for it to make sense to pick something other than default? Does twiddling any of the tuning knobs make sense for mere mortals trying to make a purse from a sow's ear, as opposed to a megacorp who can choose to throw money at their project instead? Ideas on what matters, how you test to see if your changes make sense, or if it's not worth the time at all.
There used to be a ton of reason to dive into the IO scheduler situation. If you recall back in the mid to late 2000s when completely fair queuing made its way into the Linux ecosystem, CFQ was the new disk scheduler that promised to be better than all the disk schedulers that came before it, and it did in fact offer super high throughput, and so all the major distros immediately bundled it in. Unfortunately, CFQ, unlike a lot of disk queue schedulers, is not just like this is what it is and it's what you get. It is highly tunable, and none of those distro maintainers tuned it. And the default configuration for CFQ as it was included was tuned for throughput at the expense of all else. Now, this is generally a sensible thing to do on like a large file server that services a ton of people and your major constraint is throughput. Unfortunately, throughput is the enemy of latency. And most of the people that were encountering these things, there are millions of people out there with Linux desktops. And you know what you don't want on a desktop operating system? You don't want throughput at the expense of latency. Because it turns out when a human clicks on an icon on the desktop, they expect a window to open right then, not whenever it's convenient for the system to do it, because the area of storage the system needs to access in order to open that application happens to be contiguous with some other request it's fulfilling right then. So with CFQ in its default configuration for maximum throughput, latency was terrible and any number of applications absolutely sucked. Now, the response to this across Linux land was everybody just ripping out CFQ first at the individual user level and then at the distro level and replacing it with simpler schedulers like Deadline or none. And that approach does work, especially if what you want is latency, which usually is actually going to be the biggest concern, especially for a home user or a home labber. But Deadline works fine. I don't think most people are really well served with a more complicated queue scheduler like CFQ. That makes sense to diddle with if you're in an enterprise. If you're not in an enterprise, Deadline or especially if you're on SSD, just none works really fine. It's very simple. It's very low latency. It's a great fit. And if you check, you'll probably find out that in 2024, it's what your distro is already using by default.
And in general, in the meantime, the firmware on drives, even spinning hard drives, has got smarter and more CPU power to do more of that decisions itself, right? The stuff gets queued on the hard drive instead of in the OS, and the hard drive decides what order to service them in. But in general, yeah, what Jim said, and there's a reason why if you're using ZFS, ZFS will configure the underlying disk to none so that ZFS's scheduler is there and doesn't get weird latency when it's like, oh, I purposely put this IO at the front of the line, but then the Linux IO scheduler decided to put it at the end of the line to get to the disk. And you get these priority inversions that really hurt kind of that interactive experience, especially when ZFS is doing stuff like, oh, this is a prefetch. So you asked for this. I assume you also want this other thing. So I'm going to go ask for it, but I'm going to make sure that happens after the thing you specifically asked for, so that anything you ask for always goes to the front of the line. But then if somebody else sorts it after that, it can end up putting stuff in the wrong order.
So it's a post-prefetch.
Right, well, we'd better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or your feedback. You could find me at joerest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenariesysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.